Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to welcome you to today's program. My name is Linda Maisels, and I'm the Managing Director of the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Today, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Yossi Kugler, who will be speaking on the subject Anti-Israelism, Anti-Zionism, and Anti-Semitism, Israel's Evolving View. This talk is based on or connected to his recent article in the Journal of Jewish Identities titled The Origins of Israeli Attitudes Towards the Relation between Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism. Please keep in mind that we will have time for questions at the end of Yossi's talk. The chat function is disabled, so if you have a question, we ask you please to submit it under the Q&A function. Before we get started, let me add one quick thing, which is that I hope you will join us for another webinar next week on February 25th, when we will be speaking with Claire Albin, who is currently a postdoctoral associate here at Yale and at IPSA. The title of her talk is Imagining Evil: Immigrant Holocaust Perpetrators in American Media. You can find more details about this event and others on our website. We really hope you'll join us. Please also consider signing up for our listserv so you can hear more about our other events. And now, without further delay, let's talk about today's speaker. Dr. Yossi Kugler is a historian of anti-Semitism, Holocaust memory, and Israeli society. He is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and the director of the newly established Center for Law and Anti-Semitism at the Strix Faculty of Law, College of Management. His doctoral dissertation at Tel Aviv University examined Israeli society's attitudes toward anti-Semitism during the state's 4 decades, and he currently studies the views of Israeli leaders and intellectuals toward anti-Semitism, as well as the place of Holocaust memory in public discourse. He is coming to us from Israel, and he stayed up very late to give us this talk. So, Yossi, it is so nice to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Linda. It is a pleasure and an honor to speak here today, and I would like also to thank Professor Maurice Samuels for the invitation, for the opportunity to share my work, and I will share my screen. Okay, you can see my presentation?
Yes, everything is fine.
Okay. So we start. The possible relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism remains one of the most contested issues in scholarly debates on both anti-Semitism and the Arab-Israeli conflict in the West. This debate has intensified dramatically since the October 7 massacre and the global wave of anti-Semitism that followed, widely characterized as the most severe surge in anti-Semitic incidents since World War II, leaving many political, academic, and cultural actors uncertain about how to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. Against this backdrop, the New York Times published an article in December 2023 titled, "Is Anti-Zionism Always Anti-Semitic? A Fraud Question for a Moment." A few months later, in late April 2024, following the pro-Palestinian demonstration on elite US university campuses that led to the arrest of hundreds of protesters, the newspaper New York Times noted that for universities in particular, the challenge of identifying anti-Semitism had become especially urgent. Within the Israeli public, however, there is an almost complete consensus that the two phenomena, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, cannot be separated. In a survey conducted in the mid-1990s, for example, only 14% claimed that anti-Zionism could not be defined as anti-Semitism in any way. And in an earlier survey, 85% claimed that most Arabs, or at least a significant percentage of them, are anti-Semitic. Similar results can be seen regarding people or organizations declaring they are acting against Israel policy, but are sometimes accused of anti-Semitism, such as the BDS movement. In a survey from May 2016, 70% claimed that there is a connection between the movement, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust denial. This survey is from 10 years ago, I guess I didn't find a newer survey, but I guess that if they ask the same question today, maybe 95% of the Israelis would think that the BDS is anti-Semitic. This raises an important historical question, and this is the question of this lecture and the question from the paper. When and under what circumstances did anti-Zionism begin to be perceived as anti-Semitism in Israeli society? This lecture examines how Israelis came to frame that relationship and why this shift occurred earlier than is usually assumed, a question that bears directly on Jewish self-understanding and on how perceived anti-Semitic threats are understood in the modern world and in Israel specifically. I would just say that my PhD, as Linda said before, was on the attitudes of the Israelis in the four first decades of the existence of Israel. And I showed, among others, that most of the changes in the attitudes of Israelis towards anti-Semitism occurred before 1967, before the Six-Day War, and it is in contrast to what is argued from time to time in scholarship. And I showed that many changes, for example, how Israel started to show that Israel started to perceive the Arab anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, that Israel started to think that all the world is against them or against us. All of this happened before 67. This is what I show in my dissertation. So one of the components in this dissertation is this example, which is very important for my dissertation. And I will explain what are the circumstances of my conclusion. Historically, the leadership of the Zionist movement did not equate every criticism or hostility towards their activities with anti-Semitism. David Ben-Gurion, who would later become Israel's founding prime minister, for example, despite his frustration with British policies on Jewish immigration to mandatory Palestine, particularly the 1939 White Paper, which sharply restricted Jewish immigration and land purchase, which those two activities were the main activities of the Zionist movement, Ben-Gurion cautioned against labeling all British actions as anti-Semitic. He emphasized the distinction between political motives and anti-Semitism. For example, he said once, "The English government, like any other government, has political considerations. The English government is not anti-Semitic. Of course, there are also anti-Semitic Englishmen, and a certain individual in the government could have been infected with a form of anti-Semitism. But it was not anti-Semitism that brought about the White Paper." Ben-Gurion understood that it was politics, mainly that the British prepared themselves for the war and they needed the Arabs on their side, so they had to do something for them. So they restricted the Aliyah to mandatory Palestine. And this is why they did it, not because of anti-Semitism. More than that, Ben-Gurion at times argued that Jews should not attribute all their problems to anti-Semitism. And the following quote is pretty amazing because it was said only 3 months after the end of World War II. "In my opinion, the Jewish people were mistaken for blaming anti-Semitism for all the troubles and suffering endured in the diaspora." Remember, he said it in August 1945. "This is one of the blind spots that the Jewish people were stricken in the Nechar, in the exile." Of course, one of the basic notions of Zionist movement, one of them was to talk against the diaspora, the negation of the diaspora, and part of it, the basic analysis of the Zionist movement was that the presence of Jews in the diaspora brought anti-Semitism. So here again, here also he blamed the diaspora or the existence of Jews in the diaspora for the existence of anti-Semitism. Should the world behave towards us as though we were ministering angels? It is we who assume that others will understand our spirit, produce our will, accept us with love and brotherhood, and if they do not do this, we get angry and declare that they have an evil heart and lack understanding, that they are wicked and flawed. This perspective was shared by other prominent Zionist figures, including Zev Jabotinsky, a leading figure of the Zionist right and an ideological opponent of Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion came from the Zionist left or Zionist center left. And Jabotinsky, likewise Ben-Gurion, cautioned against the overuse of accusations of anti-Semitism. The leadership of the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish community in mandatory Palestine, and the broader Zionist movement also did not perceive Arab animosity towards Zionism as rooted in anti-Semitism, as is clear from Ben-Gurion's writing and public statements. Ben-Gurion did perceive Arab attitudes towards Zionism as an expression of fierce hostility, and this is important because Ben-Gurion he did perceive Arab hostility as something fierce, as something that can bring the annihilation of the Yishuv, but he did not perceive it as anti-Semitism. So from the second half of the 1930s, and especially following the 1939 St. James Conference, when no Arab leader came to meet him, he occasionally began to attribute anti-Zionism to all Arabs. Thus, in 1940, he wrote in a letter to Justice Louis Brandeis that according to his experience in Palestine, all the Arabs, even quote-unquote the best among them, have the attitude of Yahya Effendi. Who was Yahya Effendi? Yahya Effendi was a former Arab friend of Ben-Gurion who had told him, Ben-Gurion, in 1915, when Ben-Gurion was deported from the country by the Ottomans, that as a friend, I'm sorry for this, but as an Arab, I am happy. Furthermore, as part of his famous or infamous political rhetoric, Ben-Gurion compared, and not just once, the Arabs, especially their leaders, such as the Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser, to Nazis. However, even though he sometimes compared the Arabs and their leaders to Nazis, he did make sure throughout most of his long career to describe the conflict with Arabs as a national one, thereby viewing the Arab animosity towards Zionism as anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic, as he explained to Austrian Israeli philosopher Martin Buber in a meeting the two had in February 2nd, 1962. It was a very interesting meeting. Buber came to Ben-Gurion because he asked him to give, not to punish Eichmann. This was in the end of the Eichmann trial. And then they had a short discussion about many things and also about anti-Semitism. And Ben-Gurion wrote everything in his diary. And he wrote what he said, what he told to Buber in this meeting. So he told him, when I was working in Sajara, two of my friends were killed in front of my eyes by local Arabs. But this was not anti-Semitic act, but rather an act of national struggle. Ben-Gurion repeatedly framed Arab hostility as national rather than anti-Semitic, even when acknowledging its intensity, a view that reflected a broader Zionist understanding of the conflict at the time, meaning that we understand the Arabs hate us. We understand their hatred because it is coming from a national place. So we understand it, we will fight them, but we understand their stance. And Ben-Gurion was not the only one in the Zionist leadership to understand the Arab anti-Zionist stance. As can be imagined, this was a perception more commonly found among liberal and leftist elements in the Zionist movement, such as Brit Shalom. Brit Shalom was a political movement. They were more left than Ben-Gurion and Mapai, and they were talking about binational solution. So of course that they understood the Arab anti-Zionism, they understood the animosity. But this understanding could also be found among right-wing elements, such as Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky wrote the following in his central writing, The Iron Wall from 1923. Every native population, whether civilized or primitive, regards their land as its national home, where it wishes to remain forever the sole master. It will not willingly grant entry, not only to new master, but even to new participants or partners in the management of that household. Meaning that he understands the animosity, but he said, even though I understand them, we need to fight them. We need to create an iron wall between us. At the time of state's founding, it seems that the early Israelis viewed Arab anti-Zionist animosity not as anti-Semitism, but rather as a form of hostility held by one national movement towards another, except during particularly violent episodes such as the 1921 Jaffa riots, מאורעות תרפ"א in Hebrew, and the 1929 Palestinian riots, the מאורעות תרפ"ט, and then people, Jews in the land of Israel, they were talking about anti-Semitism, about pogrom. They used terms of the diaspora of anti-Semitism. But besides that, between these riots and the establishment of the State of Israel, and a bit later, the Jews in the land of Israel and then the Israelis viewed the Arab anti-Zionism not as anti-Semitism, but as national animosity. In their view, this hostility, which could even bring about the annihilation of the young state and therefore had to be fought firmly, was not seen as anti-Semitism, but as a normal, I'm using air quotes, a normal form of hostility towards a national entity. This thinking had several roots, a major one being the common belief that Zionism succeeded in its mission to leave anti-Semitism behind in Europe, especially following the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. So we all know that one of the goals of Zionism was to do something with anti-Semitism, to bring solution to anti-Semitism, maybe to eradicate anti-Semitism. And Israelis, after the state was created, they felt that maybe Zionism succeeded because the Holocaust happened there in Europe, and here we are winning. We have established a country. We won the 1948 war. So they felt that that anti-Semitism left behind in Europe. At that time, the Zionist ethos was at its height, including the Zionism heroism myth and the ethos of the new Jew. And it's important to say that one of the basic components of Zionist ideology was the thinking that Zionism is creating the new Jew, a Jew that would have a real connection to the soil, to the land, that would have a land, that would have an autonomous land of a country of its own. And as part of this myth, of this ethos of the new Jew, this myth perpetuated the belief that anti-Semitism, as well as pogroms, ghettos, shooting pits, camps, and the Jewish culture of destruction in general were left in the diaspora. That we succeeded in leaving anti-Semitism behind us. Israel Uproots Anti-Semitism was the title of an article written by Israeli historian and educator Ephraim Shmueli just after the establishment of the state. Zionism is the classic medication to anti-Semitism, was written by Moshe Ar in the Cherut newspaper in 1949. In those years, only a few argued that there was a fundamental connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The word fundamental is crucial here because, of course, there were accusations against specific people claiming the individual in question is not just anti-Zionist, but also anti-Semitic. In other words, there appear to have been some level of differentiation whereby accusations of anti-Semitism did not result directly from accusations of anti-Zionism, while someone could nevertheless be accused of being both anti-Semite and anti-Zionist. He is anti-Zionist and also anti-Semitic. He is not anti-Semitic because he is anti-Zionist. In 1948, Ezra Reichert was one of the few who did write about the connection between these two phenomena, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, asserting that a distinct manifestation could be found in the activity of the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, during the Holocaust. He added that the establishment of the State of Israel would unfortunately not eliminate anti-Semitism, and that not only would diasporic Jews continue to suffer from it, but Israelis as well. Reichert's warning, however, did not resonate broadly at the time. So when did this change occur? When did Israelis begin to perceive anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism? Many scholars locate the turning point in the transformative impact of the Six-Day War. The war undeniably reshaped Israeli society. In its aftermath, Israeli identity became more traditional, more religious, more Jewish, and less universalist. And what is important to say here is that the Zionist movement, the mainstream of the Zionist movement in its core was secular, maybe socialist, we could say, and universalist. One of the main visions of Zionist movement was to turn the Jews into a nation like any other nation, to normalize the Jews. This is a universalist vision. So for many observers, this moment, the Six-Day War, marks a decisive shift in Israeli history, as Tom Segev famously suggested in the title of his book, 1967, and the country had changed its face, in Hebrew, Va'aretz shinta et paneh. So according to the scholars, there was this turning point in Israeli identity, and there was a turning point, and I will talk about it, that the Jews became less universalist, more Jewish. They started to talk not about the will to be a nation like any other nation, but the opposite, to be a people that shall dwell alone. There was this shift in Israeli identity, and because there was this shift, some scholars say that this is why Israel started to talk about anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. So scholars therefore argue that this war fundamentally altered how Israelis understood anti-Semitism, how they understood their place in the world, establishing a conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as part of a broader cultural transformation. Yet, this explanation attributes the shift primarily to internal developments. What these scholars argue is that anti-Zionism did not change, anti-Semitism did not change. The Israelis changed. Israelis started to perceive the world differently, and they started to think that all the world is against them, against us. And this is why they started to think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and maybe anti-Zionism did not change into anti-Semitism. So this explanation attributes the shift primarily to internal developments within Israeli society, while overlooking external forces, namely changes in how Jews in Israel were actually treated and discussed in the state's first 2 decades. A closer look at Israeli newspapers and other contemporary sources from the period between 48 and 67 suggests something different, that this shift had already begun, the shift of Israelis starting to think about anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, that this shift had already begun roughly a decade and a half earlier in response to events unrelated to the Arab-Israeli conflict. First, the Stansky trial in Czechoslovakia, Stalin's show trial in 1952, in which 14 communist officials, 11 of them Jews, were accused of leading a Zionist imperialist conspiracy the formal accusation, and executed after forced confessions. And the second, the doctors' plot in Soviet Union, a fabricated anti-Semitic campaign in 1953, accusing predominantly Jewish doctors of conspiring to assassinate by poisoning the Soviet leaders. After Stalin's death, the charges were dismissed, and this is why we call it doctor's plot and not the doctor's trial. These developments should be understood against the backdrop of shifting Soviet policy towards Jews and Zionism. Initially, the Soviet regime opposed anti-Semitism, associating it with the Tsarist past and outlawing it in principle. During the early years of the Cold War, it even supported the Zionist movement, particularly during the 1947 UN partition debate and the 1948 war. However, as Israel began aligning with the United States, Soviet policy shifted sharply. The USSR adopted an increasingly anti-Zionist stance that soon took overtly anti-Semitic forms, targeting Jews within the Soviet Union and across the Eastern Bloc. This exposed a state-led discourse in which anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism appeared closely intertwined, prompting many Israelis as well as Jews elsewhere to begin understanding anti-Zionism itself as anti-Semitism, especially as the anti-Semitic campaigns were accompanied by increasingly hostile rhetoric about an alleged global Zionist conspiracy. So the allegations were anti-Zionist, but the affairs themselves were anti-Semitic. This rhetoric can be seen, for example, when the Pravda published the accusations on January 13, 1953, against the 9 doctors, warning of vast Zionist plot threatening world peace. The doctors were recruited by a branch office of American intelligence, the International Jewish Bourgeois Nationalist Organization called Joint. The filthy face of the Zionist spy organization covering up their vicious actions under the mask of charity is now completely exposed. Unmasking the gang of poisoner doctors struck a blow against the International Jewish Zionist Organization. Now all can see what sort of philanthropists and friends of peace hid beneath the signboard of a Joint. And we should say that with these affairs, anti-Semitic affairs, the Soviets began with something very important even for today, propaganda, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist propaganda presenting Zionism as the most evil thing in the world, in the universe. Zionism as colonialism, Zionism as racism, Zionism as fascism, Zionism as Nazism. Of course, this propaganda, this language led to the 1975 UN resolution equating Zionism with racism. And it also, this propaganda influenced the contemporary anti-Zionist discourse in the campuses today. Once publicized, Jewish communist elements in Israel and abroad refused to identify these trials as anti-Semitic, arguing that anti-Zionism should in no way be defined as anti-Semitism. So the statement, no, it is just anti-Zionism, is not new. For example, following the trials, a publicist for the Israeli communist newspaper Kol Ha'am wrote that anti-Semitism is the theory of racist fascism, while the war against Zionism is a defense against American spying, meaning that we can find anti-Semitism only on the political right, on the political far right. However, most Jewish commentators and organizations in Israel and abroad view the trials as anti-Semitic, a perception reflected in an extensive Israeli public and diplomatic campaign against Soviet anti-Semitism that soon followed. The campaign, conducted both domestically and internationally, clearly defined the Soviet attitude towards the Jews of the USSR as anti-Semitic and called for the right to emigrate to Israel. It was advanced through speeches in the Knesset, appeals to public opinion in the West, and multilateral efforts such as a special session in the UN. Thus, for example, Israel's foreign minister at the time, Moshe Sharet, declared that the trials, declared the following in the Knesset, that the trials were imbued with malignant anti-Semitic spirit. This point challenges the argument made by some scholars that Israel only took action on behalf of diaspora Jews when doing so did not endanger its own strategic interests. And of course, it was very dangerous for Israel to conduct to struggle against the Soviet anti-Semitism because the Soviets, as I said before, supported Israel in the UN with the partition plan and in the 48 war, and the Israelis were very afraid that if they talk against the Soviets, if they talk in favor of immigrations of Jews outside of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union would harm the Jews in the Soviet Union. So it was a real risk to struggle these affairs. Of relevance here is the emergence in early 1950s Israeli discourse of the claim that the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism was no longer tenable. Moshe Bar, an Israeli activist combating anti-Semitism, wrote in November 1952 that hatred towards Israel and towards Jewishness are one and the same. This argument was also expressed in Davar, Mapai's newspaper, in two articles published on the same day in February 1953. The first stated that in our time, Judaism and Zionism, as well as the diaspora and the state of Israel, cannot be separated. From this follows the new conjunction of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is the most tangible form of any struggles against the Jews. The second article sharpened this claim, arguing that it is hollow claim that anti-Zionism and anti-cosmopolitanism do not amount to anti-Semitism. Their aim and purpose are one and the same, whatever the wording may be. This argument was not raised only by Jews in Israel, but also by Jews in the diaspora. For example, and remember that what scholars argue is that the argument that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism came from Israel and only after 67, because this shift in the Israeli identity. So here we will hear non-Israeli, a Jew, arguing that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism before 67. So, for example, following the reports of the doctor's plot, Dr. Abraham Cohen, president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, stated that those defending the actions in Prague and Moscow sought to separate anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism by claiming that no attack on Judaism was involved. A distinction Cohen described as incorrect. The shift in Israeli perceptions of anti-Semitism following the Slansky trial and the Doxo plot was accompanied by another perceptual change. Until these events, anti-Semitism was mainly recognized by the Israeli public as a fascist phenomenon. This understanding was strengthened by the Soviet government's official denunciation of anti-Semitism over the years, the notion that the Soviet had saved the Jews from a total annihilation during the Holocaust, and the belief that the Soviet partisans had a relatively positive attitudes towards Jews during the war. However, from this point on, anti-Semitism began to also be perceived as the leftist phenomenon as well. Here only Soviet leftists and not yet liberal leftists. The period between the trials and the Six-Day War also saw a shift in how Israeli society perceived Arab anti-Zionism. Israelis increasingly viewed it as a form of anti-Semitism as well. Again, not after 67, but between 48 and 67. This shift was a result of the Arab rhetoric calling for the annihilation of the Israeli state, the comparison of the Arab leaders to Nazis by the Israeli leadership, the Eichmann trial that heightened Holocaust awareness within Israeli society, and writings published by Yoshafat Rakabi on Arab anti-Semitism. At the same time, the exposure to Soviet anti-Semitism in the early 1950s and the growing tendency to identify anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism prompted a deeper, more unsettling reflection. Had Zionism failed to eliminate anti-Semitism? One contemporary Israeli commentary put it starkly in early 1953. It was thought that with the establishment of the State of Israel, antisemitism would disappear from the world. But reality disapproved this assumption. Through various veils, hatred of Jews seeps through. These reflections did not disappear with time. The question of whether Zionism had succeeded in eradicating antisemitism has resurfaced repeatedly in times of crisis. Thus, in the early 2000s, following the wave of antisemitism that accompanied the Second Intifada, Haaretz hosted a discussion among several experts, including antisemitism scholars such as Dina Porat and Robert Wistrich, that focused precisely on this issue. More recently, following the Hamas-led massacre of October 7, historian Moshe Zimmerman declared that the massacre proved that Zionism has failed. It seems that, by and large, the Six-Day War did not fundamentally alter Israeli attitudes towards antisemitism, but rather intensified conceptions that had already begun to take shape. The combination of deep anxiety of the waiting period and the subsequent swift victory, experienced as a collective catharsis, contributed to a heightened sense of Jewish isolation, a perception that Israel could rely chiefly on Jewish support abroad, and the renewed emphasis on the Jewish component of Israeli identity, strengthened by the symbolic and religious significance of the returns to the holy sites. This view that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism cannot be separated, which had begun to emerge in the early 1950s, gained broader acceptance by the late 1960s. It was then reinforced by increasingly blatant attacks on Jews in the name of anti-Zionism, such as the anti-Semitic campaign in Poland in 1968 and the President Charles de Gaulle's notorious remark on November 27, 1967. Around the same time, academic works began to appear that argued systematically that anti-Zionism had become a form of antisemitism. One of the most influential was Leon Polyakov, From Anti-Zionism to Anti-Semitism, originally published in France in 1969 and translated into Hebrew the following year. Alongside this broader acceptance of the link between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the ideological attribution of antisemitism has also begun to shift. As we have seen, until then, it had been perceived by Israelis primarily as a phenomenon of the fascist and the communist left. However, from the late 1960s and early 70s onwards, now we are after 67, antisemitism began to be associated not only with Soviet or socialist left, but increasingly also with liberal and progressive circles. Thus, for example, Yehuda Gottlieb, editor-in-chief of Davar and the product of the leftist Hashomer HaTzair movement, wrote in 1970s, right and left, and he put left in air quotes, have joined together to rekindle the old new antisemitism. The crossfire in which the Jewish people, Zionism, and the State of Israel are currently trapped originated by both sides of Europe, and this is without mentioning the racist antisemitism of the Afro-Americans and the zoological hatred of the Arabs, clearly shows that the circle of illusions which was fostered from the beginning of the emancipation is about to reach its end, as it has proven to be false following the distorted incarnations of liberalism and socialism. Israeli perceptions of isolation were further intensified by a series of events in the 70s and beyond. The Yom Kippur War, terror attacks against Israelis abroad in the Munich Olympics and the Entebbe and the other terror attacks, the UN resolution equating Zionism with racism, and the election of Menachem Begin as prime minister. One additional layer concerns political division. Until roughly the 1970s, Israeli discourse on antisemitism did not map neatly onto clear partisan camps. There was more shared ground than ideological polarization. From the late 1970s onwards, however, attitudes towards antisemitism increasingly became entangled with broader political identities, And disagreements over how to understand hostility towards Israel began to reflect emerging divisions within Israeli society. One side of the political divide tends to perceive hostility towards Israel as evidence of persistent and deeply rooted antisemitism, often invoking themes of isolation and historical continuity, expressed through motives such as the old world is against us, or people that shall dwell alone. The other tends to emphasize distinguishing antisemitism from political criticism, focusing on how international reflections may be shaped by Israeli policy, sometimes captured in the idea that our actions bring us closer or push us away. The aftermath of October 7 briefly produced a renewed sense of consensus, as antisemitism was widely recognized across the political spectrum as a central concern. Yet, this moment proved temporary. As public debate stabilized, familiar disagreements re-emerged, once again linking interpretations of antisemitism to deeper political worldviews, including renewed debates over government policy and the conduct of the war. To conclude, much of the academic literature assumes that Israelis began equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism only after 1967 as part of an internal transformation in Israeli identity. According to that view, it was Israeli society that changed, not the nature of anti-Zionism itself, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism. What I have to show, what I've tried to show today and in the article is that the shift began earlier, in the early 1950s, in response to external developments, especially Soviet and Arab hostility, that blurred the boundary between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in ways Israelis could no longer ignore. In other words, this was not simply an internal cultural evolution, but a reaction to changes in the surrounding political and ideological environment. Thank you very much.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I couldn't see myself. I wasn't sure if I was on. Yossi, thank you so much. I think that often in North America, maybe in other places as well, we're very focused on American attitudes toward, say, American Jewish attitudes towards anti-Semitism. So I think it's fascinating to hear about this evolution of Israeli attitudes. I can see that we have several questions. They look like good ones. I will start asking, but I would love to have you, before we start, just a sentence or two about the Center for Law and Anti-Semitism. I know it's new and you're fairly new there, so please let us know a little more about the work that you're doing there.
Okay, so the center was established a year ago by the dean of the law school, Ruti Levenstein-Lazar. I don't know if she's here. And she's not coming from the field of anti-Semitism, but she understood that there is a real lack of researching of anti-Semitism and dealing with anti-Semitism with law school. There is this perception that Jews are strong enough and they don't need the defense of, or maybe this is the reason of law assistance because they are white and strong and so on and so forth. So she established the center. We have a very distinguished steering committee with Erwin Kotler and Eliakim Rubinstein, and I entered my position in last June. I'm, as you said before, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm coming from the anti-Semitism, in the field of anti-Semitism, in the field of Israel studies and Holocaust studies, somewhere between them. And this is a real challenge for me to enter this world, even though I know all the connections many connections between anti-Semitism and law. And in the center, we have, I would say, three goals. The first one is the goal of academic research. Of course, we are in an academic college with publications and everything. The second one is activism. We want not hasbara or something like this, but we want I think 2 years from now, maybe 3 or 5 years, to start training policymakers or educators or opinion leaders to advise to legislators about law and anti-Semitism. And the third one is education, not necessarily from the perspective of law, of education of how to understand anti-Semitism properly. I think that we have a problem all over the world of how to understand anti-Semitism, and the phenomenon of anti-Semitism is polarized, it's politicized. Some say that anti-Zionism cannot be, in any case, anti-Semitic. In Israel, many people say that everything is anti-Semitic. I'm coming from this world, from the world of education, from Yad Vashem. So one of our goals is try to assist in this field, and we already had some Zoom events. Yesterday we had the third one. Everything is open for the public, is free, because we want to bring a more healthy and accurate discourse about anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much for that. Of course, we wish you the best of luck with that
Thank
endeavor.
you very much.
And your answer actually segues nicely into our first question from Monica, who says that she thinks one of the biggest challenges in this is the lack of a shared definition of either Zionism or anti-Zionism. Do you, in your work, start with a working definition?
We have the working definition of anti-Semitism of IRA, and we have world wars over this definition. So it's going to be very interesting to see how big the wars about what Zionism is and what anti-Zionism is are going to be. I really don't know, but many people discuss about it, that if the question right now it's not what anti-Semitism is, but what anti-Zionism is, because everyone more or less agree that neo-Nazis are anti-Semitic, and that no, ISIS are anti-Semitic, is anti-Semitic. Not everyone agrees about Hamas, but Hezbollah. And the question is about things related to Israel. So let's define anti-Zionism. I don't think it would help, because I think there is a real disagreement about this, and I don't think that a definition would assist to move someone from his ideological camp. Unfortunately, I'm saying it, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. And Monica, thank you for that question.
Thank
Excuse me.
you.
We have a second question from Goni. While anti-Zionism in the Arab world maintains certain aspects taken from Soviet anti-Zionism, its roots can also be traced to other religious nationalist origins, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood. So when thinking about anti-Zionism, particularly that which has which has manifested on Western campuses and streets, do you feel that this is a transmutation of specific Soviet or Arab, or is it a totally new strain of Zionism, or is it all mixed in together?
Everything is mixed in together. Anti-Semitism is ideology. Ideology moves. So, for example, anti-Semitism, of course, began in the Western world, in the Christian world, as anti-Judaism. It morphed and reshaped until it in the Middle Ages came to be anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism arrived to the Middle East only in the 19th century. And this is something very important to say, especially in Israel. We need to remember long centuries of relative tolerance towards Jews under Islam. Anti-Semitism arrived to the Middle East only in the 19th century. Now we see that anti-Semitism goes from the Middle East to Europe by some of the immigrants coming from Syria and Afghanistan, other places, but sometimes it's anti-Semitism itself, and sometimes it's just the language, because what Soviets brought to the West is not the concept of hating Jews, but it's the language, the trick of saying that we hate Jews, but it's just Zionists but we truly have a problem with Jews. So sometimes the move of anti-Semitism is the ideology itself. For example, when blood libels entered for the first time to the Middle East in the 19th century, and the conspiracy theories, and they translated and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was translated in the beginning of the 20th century. But I think in the case of the Soviet Union, it's interesting. I don't think that anti-Semitism moved, but only the language, the propaganda, the trick. Unfortunately, there were good roots there are good roots of anti-Semitism in the West. What can we do in Western culture?
I think that, reminiscent of certainly David Nirenberg's book work, talking about how, you have core anti-Jewish concepts that were then there's an overlay almost of real anti-Semitic concepts. One of the other things that I think that we've heard in connection with current, with protesters on Western campuses, Isabella Tabarovsky, for instance, has made a direct connection between, as you said, the words or the tricks, anti-Semitic propaganda that was espoused by the former Soviet Union in the Soviet Union that is now showing up in contemporary protest by young people who may not even know where that rhetoric is coming from.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to encourage also. Oh, I see we have another new question. Terrific. But people, we still have time, so please continue to put in your questions. This next one, mentioning that you mentioned the transformation of the merging of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism at the time of the Six-Day War, and also the pivot of Israel away from socialism at that point, Czechoslovakia and Russia in the 1950s, those examples. And the question is the lean away from the USSR and greater alignment with the USS sorry, I'm not reading this very well, with the United States that occurred just prior to the Six-Day War. Is it your opinion that this propaganda war between the USSR and the US also had its beginnings, though not fulfillment, prior to the Six-Day War? Did I garble that enough that you didn't understand that?
I didn't understand. I need to read it again.
I think so. He gave it a number of examples. The core question, is it your opinion that the propaganda that took place between the USSR and the US had its beginnings, though not its fulfillment, prior to the Six-Day War? Is that consonant with your argument?
The Cold War began. We know that it began before Six-Day War, but
I think that your discussion about the merging of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, that you saw that as a phenomenon, that really that merging was very conspicuous during the Six-Day War. Do you think that the propaganda war between the USSR and the US also had its beginnings prior to the Six-Day War? So if we're seeing you have sort of a lead up to the Six-Day War, is that propaganda uh, uh, sort of conflict taking place prior also to the Six-Day War?
I think that the propaganda war between USSR and the Soviet Union and the United States, of course, began before Six-Day War. What is, I think, relevant for my argument is that the context of the beginning of this anti-Semitic, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist propaganda. The context is the Cold War, of course, because the Soviet Union in the beginning supported Zionism, and not in the beginning of Soviet Union, not in the beginning of the Zionism, but right after the war, Soviet Union supported Zionism. They had this vision of Israel as a communist country in the Middle East. And then Israel had to support in 1950, had to go with the West during the Korean War. And there was a great disappointment in Soviet Union, and so this is the context. This is part of the story, and the reason. And by the way, it is interesting because every time there is this, I don't know, maybe illusion or thought that something would work better, maybe that the Soviets want to be anti-Semitic, and then it's like in stages that the Soviets protect Jews and they want to be anti-Semitic, and then Jews discover this anti-Semitism. Of course, the Jews understood, Israelis and Jews understood that there is anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, but they were thinking that it's mainly from the grassroots, and the leadership is not anti-Semitic, and they protect their Jews. And even when there were rumors in the end of the 40s, there was this anti-cosmopolitan purges, anti-Semitic anti-cosmopolitan purges in 48, 49, in which 70 to 80% of the persecuted were Jews. Rumors for that came to Foreign Ministry of Israel, but Israeli officials dismissed it, saying that the Soviets protect the Jews. It cannot be true. They didn't believe it, and the leaderships came from the left in Israel. And we need to remember that the ruling party was Mapai in the left, and the ruling elites came from the left. So it was very difficult. And when I read, when I showed the quote of Yehuda Gottlieb, who was the chief in editor of Davar, and I wrote there that he was raised in the Hashomer HaTzair, which is very important. Hashomer HaTzair is a very leftist movement, and so there was a real heartbreak in the left, in the Israel left, about the appearance, first of the appearance of the anti-Semitism in the Soviet left, and then in the liberal left. There was, by the way, disappointment among American Jews before Six-Day War, because American Jews were thinking that after they went hand in hand with their allies during the struggles in the civil movement rights, their allies would support them during their hour of need, but in the waiting period, they thought that the allies in America would show them some solidarity about what they feel about Israel, about the situation in Israel. Many Jews around the world in the waiting period, and 3 weeks before Six-Day War, they were writing about Holocaust, about Auschwitz. Even non-Zionist Jews, even anti-Zionist Jews, they were talking about Auschwitz, about Holocaust, and the Zionist ones, they were thinking that their allies would be with them. They show them solidarity about the danger in the Middle East, and they didn't show them. So here again we have another heartbreak for Jews. And it was very clear from the quote of Yehuda Gottlieb.
Thank you for
I don't know if I answered the question, but
Well, I have to tell you, I don't think I asked it very well, so I'm not going to put that on you. I'll put that on me. I think we have like 2 minutes left, so very quickly, I'd like to get to this next question. The questioner Nathaniel talks about Israel having an illusion of safety at its beginning, and the diaspora Jewish community having an illusion of belonging. That both of those communities ignored the crucial question of indigeneity. So indigenous to the land. So the question is this: if indigeneity joins people and land, does that render the desire to separate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, making it something of an abstract argument, or part of this illusion that Israel was safe and the diaspora Jews belonged where they were?
I think this illusion of safety. I think you told me that you stayed in Israel in the second Intifada. I don't think if you felt safe. I don't think that there is a real illusion of safety in Israel. So first of all, we need to say, even before October 7, we didn't believe that there would be pogroms in Israel and there would be massacres. So this is something else. But I think that the vision of that, us Zionists would be able to leave anti-Semitism behind us, it came because the basic analysis of Zionist movement was that the existence of Jews in the diaspora, this is what creates anti-Semitism. So if we separate Jews from the diaspora, from other nations, and the Jews moved to the land of Israel, there they would connect to the land, to their land, to their promised land, and with this connection, they would become something indigenous, and then they would become a normal nation, and normal nations suffers only from normal hatred, from national hatred. And this is why the first Israelis were thinking about anti-Zionism as something national and not as something anti-Semitic.
Thank, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I know that one of the questions that we need to answer here in the West is about Israeli indigeneity, and that perhaps is something that has spurred some of the anti-Semitism or the animosity against Jews within the context of the diaspora. But with that, I think that we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank you so much again for staying up late and being with us,
Thank
and
you. No
to
problem.
remind our listeners that we will have another webinar next Wednesday, and we hope you will join us. Thank you so much.